So good day, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you joining us today, and thank you for your patience. My name is Ali Rizk, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's session and one of the panelists. This webinar marks the kickoff of a couple of webinars that we will be doing in July. It will be on building operational resilience, of course, and today I will also be chairing the session, helping and guiding the discussion. So as I mentioned, this webinar actually comes in a response to many questions and clarifications that we've been having honestly with our clients around operational resilience, around the regulation, around the risk integration. So we thought of why don't we design a series to provide clarity and practical direction to everyone. So before we jump into today's session, let me just give you a brief on our next webinar. So today's webinar, we'll be talking about the regulatory landscape. However, in the second webinar, we'll be talking about topics such as third-party risk management, technology, AI risk, ESG, climate-related risks, and sort of building a resilience culture. So please do stay tuned, and we hope as well to see you in those webinars. So today's focus, like I said, regulatory landscape and expectations, which honestly couldn't be more timely or relevant. As we all know, regulators around the world are raising or increasingly raising the bar when it comes to operational resilience. From the UK PRA to the EU DORA to even the recent draft regulations issued by the CBUAE. So we're seeing a clear shift towards a stronger mandate, whether it's around governance, scenario testing, third-party resilience, impact tolerance, or as CBOAE call it, tolerance for disruption, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, beyond compliance, the concept of operational resilience is now at the heart of each institution that wants to ensure continuity, protect its customers, and build long-term trust. That's exactly what we're here to explore today. And if you see on my screen, a couple of questions that we're gonna handle, they are key questions. What is operational resilience? Why have regulators began focusing on it? What do regulators expect? How does it relate to other functions like BCM and ORM? And how can your existing framework support regulatory expectations? In this respect, we're fortunate enough today to be joined by, honestly, an outstanding group of experts. We have on the panel Mr. Andrew Sheen, who is a renowned thought leader in risk regulation and a former PRA specialist. We have Dr. David Cooper, who brings decades of international experience in risk management. And we have Dr. Jimmy Hinchcliffe, who is a seasoned expert in operational risk and regulations across the GCC, Europe, and the UK. Our agenda for the day is, first we start by the presentation, then we shift to your question and we answer them. And also please do note that this is an interactive session. So whatever you feel like, if you have any question, just put it on the chat and we'll try to answer as much as possible from your question. Finally, if anyone would, for example, like to discuss a certain topic which is not addressed today, please do let us know. We're trying to make these webinars, the second and the third, as much beneficial as possible to you. So if there's any interest in any topic, please do drop us a message and we'll design that. We'll take it into consideration next accordingly. Finally, before I give the speech to my fellow panelists, if anyone also would like a one-on-one discussion so we can support them or discuss any topic they see may be beneficial to them, or they would like to deep dive in it, would be our pleasure. Please do let us know. So with that, let's get started. I'll first turn to Dr. Jimmy. So we talked through the global regulatory evolution, and Let's get it done. Jimmy, to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Elliot, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. And really good to see some very familiar faces in the attendee list. So hello to you. So on these first couple of slides, we've got a bit of an overview on the global focus. First and foremost, and a bit biased here, but the UK, and of course the UK has been focusing on operational resilience for a good sort of 9 years now, which is pretty astonishing. And we'll explain a bit more in terms of the reasons for that focus and the UK approach as we go through this presentation. Not unusual for UK regulators to go first in terms of developing new policy. But the rest of the examples that we give here are very much followed on from the BCBS in terms of the BCBS principles that Andrew's going to talk about in a few minutes. The EU on there, Ellie already mentioned DORA, this acronym which has given many sleepless nights to firms who were caught by this over the last few years. But the EU chose to focus very much on ICT resilience, and we might say a word about that as well a little bit later. So on the next slide, again, we have a few more examples of regulators that have issued new policy on operational resilience. Singapore there, the MAS, the US, and Canada as well, OSFI. And again, I think the common pattern here is, I guess, two things. Number one, that operational resilience really has become a focus for all regulators. So it really is an area of high priority for regulators. And number two, that in general terms, most regulators have very much followed on from the BCBS principles. And David will talk a bit later about this UK policy, which I mentioned in relation to the previous slide. But actually, the UK approach to operational resilience has actually become a really useful blueprint in terms of this kind of how question of how you actually deliver on the BCBS principles. And as I mentioned, David will go through that a little bit later. So it's become a clear focus, including critically within the Middle East region. So we're seeing now multiple regulators, as Ellie mentioned as well, the Central Bank of UAE coming out with their draft policy, but we're seeing multiple regulators in the region coming out with policy on operational resilience. So it really is becoming a big focus in the region. And if we go on to the next slide, so this is quite an interesting one. Certainly when we've been doing training and conferences and obviously working with clients, a number of whom we've been working with for the last 4 or 5 years to deliver on the UK regime. Always one of the questions or the points of confusion is exactly what are we talking about when we talk about operational resilience? Yeah, is it a new risk? Is it just a rebranding of business continuity management? Is it a subset of operational risk, or is it an outcome? And if we go on to the next slide, before we answer this critical question, take a bit of a step back, because I think it's important to look at operational resilience in this broader context of enterprise resilience. So financial resilience, this was the big focus post the global financial crisis, more capital, more liquidity, sorting out that. And then we got onto strategic resilience, looking at business models, governance, accountability, making sure that the boards and board members were appropriate, had appropriate skills and experience. So we saw a lot of focus on that. And then after those two were dealt with, if you like, by international regulators, we then got on to the third piece, which is around operational resilience. And if we go on to the next slide, we got a couple of really good quotes here, which I hope answer this question 2 slides ago about exactly what is operational resilience. And very helpfully, BCBS always issue really good documents. It's a great organization. They produce some great principles, and on operational resilience, that's no exception. And they clarified, this is a quote from the draft principles, but operational resilience is an outcome that benefits from the effective management of operational risk. So suddenly we understand operational resilience isn't something you do, it's the result of something else that you're doing. and that is operational risk management. So it really gives a focus for operational risk management to deliver on these operational resilience outcomes. And we got a couple of other quotes there from Nick Strange at the UK regulator, and then from the US federal agencies as well. But I think now everyone is on the same page, certainly from a regulatory perspective. And certainly if you look at the draft UAE proposed rules on operational resilience, perhaps these are almost the best example we've seen of how operational resilience is really centered around operational risk management and using operational risk management to deliver on those resilience outcomes. And if we skip forward onto the next slide. So what I've done on this slide really is to try and capture a little bit in terms of what were the drivers of the UK focus on operational resilience. I mentioned on the first slide that the UK were the first to focus on operational resilience 8 or 9 years ago. So what were the drivers of that? Because I think that's quite instructive in terms of what we're talking about when it comes to operational resilience. So I think there are a number of key drivers. Firstly, around the fragile infrastructure in UK banks. So we had this huge increase in the number of IT incidents within the banks and the firms that UK regulators were looking after. And in fact, they quadrupled from an FCA perspective between 2017 and 2019, up to almost 1,000 incidents. So clearly this was a huge issue. And then we'd had the RBS incident, which you may have been familiar with back in 2012, where you had this prolonged disruption, IT-based disruption, impacting 6 million customers, causing a huge amount of harm to consumers, a huge amount of reputational damage to RBS and to the financial sector. And then almost the final straw for UK regulators was this TSB incident, which again, when we do training, it's interesting how many people in other jurisdictions have heard about the TSB incident. It really is that infamous that it's quite a globally renowned. This was in 2018, a major IT disruption causing huge amounts of harm for consumers, many millions of consumers impacted for a prolonged period. And unusually with the TSB situation, regulators, I think, twisted arms and they got TSB to commission a law firm to write a report. So we have a lot of details in terms of the failures on the TSB incident. But again, it was pretty fundamental. The other key driver is around the rising threat from the cyber landscape in terms of government actors, in terms of individuals, criminal gangs. We had this huge increase in the number of ransomware incidents over that period. Huge increase in the number of ransomware attacks, a huge amount of data breach incidents. So you had this kind of twin factor of evidence of fragile IT infrastructure within the banks, and then the rising threat landscape. You then combine this with rising customer expectations, the growing importance of IT as banks were gradually shifting to a much more digital approach to banking. And this led to, in the UK, the Parliament to commission a review on IT incidents within financial services. And ironically, on the day of the inquiry started, there was a major IT incident in the UK, just to kind of reinforce the point. You then had, I think, what proved to be quite an interesting or an important factor in as regulators were coming up with their new rules. You had, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. I think if you hadn't had that, you probably would have had a UK regime looking much more like the EU DORA, more ICT focused. What COVID-19 did is it broadened out the emphasis on resilience from just ICT and IT into looking at things like particularly people, the resilience of people, facilities, and other types of resources. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's the drivers in the UK. And if you go on to the next slide, we'll get on to the BCBS.
Hi, Jimmy. Sorry to interrupt. Just as one of the questions that's come in that maybe is kind of relevant.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I was going to take it on slide 15, David.
Okay, fine.
Talk about silos there.
Okay.
So we will,
that makes sense. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Sorry, Jimmy.
David, thanks, Jimmy. So Jimmy's talked a bit about the BCBS. For those that aren't as familiar with the acronym, it's the Basel Committee of Banking Supervisors. Had the great pleasure of sitting on their working group for operational risk for a number of years. I got the highest regard for the work that they produce. So let's just take a minute or two to dig down into what the principles for operational resilience that they first published in March 2021 are doing to drive this approach to operational resilience. And first of all, why have they thought that this was a matter for regulatory interest? As Jimmy said, there were certainly things going on in the UK which were proving problematic, but that wasn't the case globally. There were some countries where banks were resilient, but the aim is to strengthen banks' ability to absorb operational risk-related incidents. And a key point with this is the recognition that there are out there a range of hazards that can't be prevented. And so you're going to have to be prepared for these in the traditional operational risk approach, where you have causes, events, and impacts. It may be that there's nothing you can do to prevent the event, and therefore it's all about how you deal with the impact. And here, just on the third box at the top, so what are we talking about? Jimmy's already used this definition. It's the ability to withstand, adapt, and recover from potential hazards, and thereby mitigate potential severe adverse impacts. And of course, those are impacts both on you, on your safety and soundness, but also on your customers. And a key point, which Jimmy's mentioned, but I'm going to mention it again, it is so crucial to operational resilience. It's an outcome that benefits from the effective management of operational risk. How are we managing operational risk? We're doing things like risk identification and assessment. That might be things like RCSAs, those sorts of things. Risk mitigation, and there we're including controls. And then, of course, we're monitoring what's happening. And so that's activity that is undertaken in the operational risk arena, or non-financial risk perhaps arena, and that all helps us as organizations become more resilient. So this link between the operational risk function and operational resilience is something I'll come back to on the next slide, but is something that's key. And of course, if you're an operationally resilient bank, you're less likely to incur untimely lapses in your operations. You're less likely to incur disruptions, and that reduces their impact on critical operations. But also, some of these disruptions are incredibly damaging to an organization's reputation. And so by being resilient, we remove that risk as well. And if we can move on, what I'm going to do is just look at the 7 elements from the Basel Committee paper. If you could move on.
Andrew, before we move on, since you talked on the second box about some potential hazards that cannot be prevented, and as we have seen from our interactions with many people and many clients, we have got a question that maybe we should pose here so our attendees can benefit as well. So the question was, do regulators accept that there will be situations where firms are unable to do anything to continue to provide the service within their tolerance?
I think there has to be an acceptance from the regulator. One of the interesting things in the UK is the regulator is looking at the services provided by critical third parties. They haven't yet defined the entities that form those critical third parties, and the regulator themselves will be overlooking the resilience of those third parties. But if we're looking at it from a particular firm's perspective, and my cloud provider goes out, there is nothing I can do as a firm to prevent that hazard from happening. It very much sits with the cloud provider. And in fact, we have some of our clients who've engaged with the cloud provider to try and understand their resilience, and just being told to go and look at the website. So there has to be a recognition that there are certain hazards that can't be prevented. That's definitely the case.
Thank you, Andrew. So moving on.
Yeah. So these are the 7 principles that the BAL Committee's working group identified. And they're really the key message here when I look at governance, and I look at operational risk management, and I look at business continuity planning. It's all about leveraging what you're doing already. So utilize your existing governance structure. Don't set up a separate governance structure for operational resilience. You have risk committees at various levels, including the board risk committee. Utilize that existing structure. You have an operational risk management function. So leverage that function to help you identify external and internal threats to your resilience. And you have business continuity plans, and you conduct business continuity exercises. So leverage those. They all feed into your operational resilience. What's something that you may not be doing at the moment is mapping the interconnections and interdependencies. So how do you provide your critical operations? What are the resources that you use to provide your critical operations? And those can be people, facilities, those sorts of things, but it can also be third parties, and not just third parties, but nth parties. We're seeing a lot of interest in the UK and in the countries where they've been looking at operational resilience for a little longer, in this third party dependence and the nth party, you know, has a third party sub outsourced to another party. Something else that you need to leverage off is your incident management. This is this ability to undertake an analysis of what went wrong. It really is becoming a key part of everything we're seeing coming from the regulator. So you need to develop and implement response and recovery plans. You need a formal approach, an agreed structure for when you're looking at why incidents occur. We don't cover it here specifically, but we use the bow tie as a structure for understanding why incidents happen. And then finally, you need to ensure resilient ICT, and that includes things like cyber security. So if we move on, Jimmy talked about the BCBS, and he talked about the UK regulatory approach. So here's just a slide showing a couple of key UK documents. And even if you are in a regime, and if you're not in the UK, you are likely to be in a regime where the requirements are based on the BAL committee, you can use these documents, and if you go back earlier, perhaps the initial consultation papers, to answer some of the so what questions. The example I always give is your regulator will expect you to have an operational resilience policy. The first question is, what does a policy look like? If you go back into documents that are published by the Prudential Regulation Authority, they will list the sorts of things that should be in your resilience policy. They're not the only people that do that. I think the Monetary Authority of Singapore do that. So there are places where you can go just to make sure that you're on the right track. Now, moving on, one of the things that is key for operational resilience is that it encapsulates so many different, and I'm going to use the term silos. I don't like it, but you know, as part of your resilience, you need to understand your crisis management. You need to understand your vendor risk management. You need to understand information security, IT risk, and we've got things like cyber risk. And if you want to leverage your functions for the management of operational risk to get that outcome of operational resilience, the best approach is to pull all of these risk silos under a single umbrella, and most institutions that's known as the non-financial risk umbrella. And in doing so, you need to avoid the failures on conduct risk, where, for example, where we saw a big emphasis on conduct risk. Everybody went off and set up a conduct risk department. It was separate, it used separate systems, it asked the same questions, but in a different way. You need to avoid that fragmentation. You certainly need to break down these silos. And so we have a question about how financial institutions can reconcile the inherent conflict between operational risk management's focus on minimizing exposures, but also when setting, oh, sorry, that's a different, there was a previous question.
Yeah,
which was
no,
about,
Andrew, if I may, like this, the question which is important to answer, there are actually two questions from the audience, which I like to pose here since we're talking. The first one is, who do you think should own operational resilience, the first or second line? This is the first question.
Okay, the approach that I like to see, and I should say again, in the UK, the regulator has given responsibility for implementing and reporting operational risk to the Chief Operations Officer. And so that's quite clear, that's where that role should lie. It then raises the question of who owns the policy, who owns the governance arrangements, who does oversight and challenge, and that should sit in the second line. If you follow the 3 lines of defence, and you will say that as part of the 3 lines of defence, if I look at operational risk, my operational risk policy is owned by the second line, implemented in the first line, and it should be the same for operational resilience. There is a challenge there because when in the UK we saw regulators requiring firms to take measures to ensure they were resilient, there wasn't an existing operational resilience policy, and lots of chief operating officers charged with implementing the policy that didn't exist sat down and wrote the policy. And in those instances, what they need to do is transition from the first line owning the policy to the second line. And so the question that's behind this for me is if the person who writes the policy is setting the exam question, the person who implements the policy is answering the exam question, and the person that looks at how well that's been done is marking the exam question. And I don't feel that you can say you follow the 3 lines of defence and have the first line writing the exam question, answering the exam question, and then marking the exam question. So for me, the first line owns implementing and reporting, and everything else sits in the second line. So thanks for that question, Ellie, because that's a...
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. A very quite detailed explanation. And before we move on, because we have another question as well that was raised, and I feel we should tackle it here as well in this slide. So one of the questions from the attendees is, how can financial institutions balance board-level accountability for resilience outcomes with the need for cross-functional integration? Example, cybersecurity, third-party risk, in a siloed regulatory landscape. Actually, I know you have sort of indirectly answered this in the previous slides, but if we can briefly just give our attendees a quick answer.
Sure. To me, it's very much about breaking these silos. So I worked in an organization where they had very distinct silos. It didn't actually help the organization manage its operational risk or its resilience. And so one of the things they did was they introduced a program to break down these silos and get everybody working together. And if we look at the chart that's up there, for example, if I'm trying to be resilient, and as part of that end-to-end process, my vendor risk management team isn't actively involved, or my cyber risk team isn't actively involved, then I'm not going to achieve the sorts of resilience that I need to for the safety and soundness of my firm, but also that the regulator would expect. So it's very much about breaking down these silos. And for me, the function that's best placed to do that would be operational risk. in the form of a kind of non-financial risk umbrella.
Exactly, I agree. It's a collaboration effort, not a race between departments. Otherwise, it will not work.
Yeah, that's lovely. Definitely not a race. Yeah.
So,
Moving on.
sorry. Yeah. So again, just maybe before I move on
Yeah.
to this, there was, I think the next question that had come up was around, it's okay to move to the next slide, Ellie, I think, but just wanted to highlight this next question, and maybe I can have kind of the first go at answering this, and Jimmy and Andrew or Ellie might want to add to it.
Yeah.
So this is how can financial institutions reconcile the inherent conflict between operational risk management's focus on minimizing exposures through controls and operation, which is one part, and operational resilience requirement to maintain critical functions during high impact disruptions, particularly when setting risk appetite versus disruption tolerance. So again, I think this is a really, really great question. It actually pulls together, I think, some of the really important parts around a resilience framework. And kind of, if I start at the final bit around risk appetite. So risk appetite and the setting of risk appetite and should actually drive your impact tolerances, or tolerances for disruption. And what we're talking about here, particularly in the UK, is how long can the customer survive without being caused kind of intolerable harm to themselves. So if a payment can't be made, how long is it before that becomes a real problem for customers? Now, every customer is different. And I'll explain a little bit on one of the later slides, the journey we've been through on the UK to really try and hammer this out. But risk appetite kind of drives everything else. On the operational risk focus, so yes, operational risk is definitely looking at identifying your risks, your controls, and reducing those or mitigating those down to an acceptable level. Again, you can go too far. Controls lost, do cost money. So it's about having that balance of a well-controlled environment. So what I would say when you were looking at critical functions and high impact disruptions, what I would say is if you have a good operational risk framework, if you do have good controls in place, which are driven by your appetite, so it's all joined up, you will actually be able to recover more quickly those critical functions in a high impact scenario. So I think the two things actually go hand in hand and complement each other. And this goes back to, I think, the fact that resilience is an outcome of good operational risk. I don't know, Jimmy, Andrew, anything you'd like to add there?
Exactly. And if I may add here, there is one key point in the question, which is they are mentioning how to reconcile the conflict. And it shouldn't be a conflict. This is why we mentioned earlier, like 2 minutes ago, it's a collaboration. So we shouldn't think of it this way. If we always think of a conflict between operation risk and operation resilience or business continuity, then it will never succeed. However, for example, think about it this way. Operation risk, as David mentioned, is the identification of risk, and consider the business continuity as the control. And then, for example, when you're setting your maximum tolerable outage or your tolerance for disruption or whatever, if later on in your review, in your yearly review, you're finding it, for example, there's a disconnect between this and the risk appetite, then one of them should be reviewed. Either you need to make your risk appetite realistic or pragmatic, not theoretical. For example, in the risk appetite, let me give a pragmatic example. If you're setting the maximum tolerable outage for your Swift service, let's say 30 minutes, and when you're doing your business impact analysis, you figure out from IT that it cannot be done, then this is a flag you should raise to your board or your management. You either invest in your technology to match your risk appetite, or you make your risk appetite more realistic by making it, for example, 30 minutes, 2 hours instead of 30 minutes. So it should go hand in hand, and it's constantly evolving. You will not get it from the first try. Like, don't put too much pressure on yourself.
I think you've raised a really good point there, Ellie, about setting tolerance for disruption. I think, and David on the next slide's got the various stages for operational resilience. This is the most difficult element for operational resilience. You can work out, develop a formal approach for what my critical operations are. Mapping the resources should be fairly straightforward, but setting your tolerance for disruption is very difficult. And the first question you have to ask yourself is, how am I even going to, what's my metric going to be? Now, for most firms, it's easiest to start with duration because you can measure duration real time. There's no point in setting your tolerance using a metric that you can't measure during the disruption. So most people start with duration, but need to look and come up with other things. But if you decide to go the duration route, you need to understand where your recovery time objective sits, where your risk appetite is, what's the customer's expectations, what are the regulators' expectations, and then this concept of impact tolerance, which is when am I going to cause intolerable harm to my customers? And it's only when you know where all those sit that you can actually say, this is where I want to set my tolerance for disruption. And so it's actually the biggest challenge that firms face. So thanks for that, Ellie.
Thank you, Andrew. Jimmy, you raised your hand. You would like to add
Yeah,
on these thoughts?
Just on this really interesting question around the conflict between op risk management and operational resilience. I think everything that's been said is right, but I think it does touch on this issue that regulators, of course, identified in terms of one of the issues that they had with operational risk management and the way it had been done in practice was that there was too much focus on the left side of the bow tie. So if you all think about that bow tie that we commonly use to look at incidents, the left side is around preventative controls. A huge amount of the focus of operational risk management has been very much on that side. RCSA, preventative controls, doing scenario analysis, developing indicators and what have you. Whereas I think the paradigm shift in operational resilience, and this is one of the key things that is different in terms of operational resilience, is that there's this emphasis, and Andrew talked about it earlier in terms of the BCBS principles, that disruptions and risks are inevitable. So with the best will in the world, with the best control infrastructure, you are going to suffer from disruptions. Therefore, you need to have that focus on the middle and the right side of the bow tie in terms of how you can adapt and recover and learn from these disruptions to try and manage them better in future. So I think that is the key thing. So really there is that need for the slight change in emphasis on the way in which operational risk managers and operational risk management has approached things, to focus also on the other aspects of the bow tie, not just on the prevention side.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.
Okay, so if I can maybe carry on with the last couple of slides, and I'll try and pick up on some of these discussions. Sorry, Eli, if we go back one, we haven't.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I'll try and pick up on a couple of things, including there's another good question come in around RTOs and impact tolerance thresholds, which I'll endeavour to discuss as we're going through here. So again, this, if you want to call it the resilience triangle, and again, we're just trying to show here really that resilience is an outcome and has a huge dependency on all that's already been done on operational risk management and business continuity. These are kind of essential components. So this really isn't about something new. I think, as we've already said, this is really about using what you've already got and what you're already leveraging, and leveraging what you have. And again, you're all working, I would say, for resilient institutions at the moment. You're all doing your business continuity testing, you're doing your operational risk framework. So in many ways, if you stand back and say, well, are we resilient? And you ask yourself some of those questions, then in many cases, you're going to be saying yes. But then there's also areas that can be improved. And as Jimmy's just mentioned, and this was one of the huge hurdles also to get over when we were working with clients in the UK, was this suspension of disbelief, if you like, that a serious event could occur. Particularly when you were talking with the IT department, you could end up spending several hours where they were just telling you it couldn't occur because of. And they were then talking about their business continuity and their recovery plans, which was great. But the regulatory viewpoint within the UK, and I think it's a good one to start with resilience, is that something has happened. So what would you do to recover? And then you're beginning to look at your business continuity plans. You're beginning to see, do you have a plan B? How would you do it? So I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But here, this is really just trying to highlight, bottom right, we're talking about business continuity. And here, yes, we're talking about recovery time objectives. So typically, a recovery time objective is around a single process or maybe a single system. and which is correct and which is very necessary. And you'll have based that RTO on probably business impact analysis as well, plus what's actually physically possible to be able to do and how much that costs. Now, the thing around resilience is you're looking at something, a process, say end to end for the customer. And that's generally made up of a number of critical processes, if you like, or a number of systems, all of which have RTOs. So in looking at operational resilience and saying we need to be able to recover this service to the customer within by the end of today or by the end of tomorrow, you're then actually then beginning to look at all of the components that go to make up to allow the customer to receive that service from start to finish. So it's a different way of looking at things. So I would say things like RTOs are an incredibly important part of your overall resilience. And you need to make sure that your RTOs are able to deliver within any tolerances or times to recovery that you've set. And again, on the left, I think we've already talked about the operational risk framework, but again, just to emphasize the importance of that. And now what we're also seeing where we've been working with clients for a number of years is this is now maturing to a point where these are all actually becoming integrated, rather than, if you like, overlaying ops resilience to begin with over the top of these, leveraging off them, using them. Now they're becoming much more integrated, I think, which I think is the way forward. So if we just go to the next slide, and I'm also conscious of time. So this is kind of the UK blueprint of kind of 8 steps through which to, if you like, be able to demonstrate operational resilience. So the first one we've talked around about it's your governance. So leverage your existing governance. Operational resilience should be a subject that's brought into, in general, your existing committee structures. It's not around creating a whole new governance framework around resilience. It should fit into your existing governance structure. Then this number 2. So what is an important business service or a critical operation? So again, this is kind of looking and focusing on the impact to the firm, potentially around any threats to the firm, but more importantly towards customers. So again, when this was beginning, and items 2, 3, 4, and 5 in here, I'd say probably took between 3 and 6 months with firms when we were originally working on this. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, and if you follow the UK blueprint, it can be done much quicker. But some people were saying everything's important, but then that was a multiplication factor on what you had to do next. So typically you ended up with single digit important business services for, I'll say, medium-sized banks, but always included things like payments. So, you'd have payments as your important business service or maybe your critical operation. But then within that, there will be subsets through which they could be made, or the different flavors, if you like, of payments. Then number 3, as Andrew said, setting this impact tolerance, which comes down to duration or time. So in the end, people would, in general, say it needs to be recovered within today, by the end of the next business day, or T+2. Anything more tighter than that was kind of creating a rod for your own back, because what you're then having to do for each of your important business services or critical operations is then this kind of important step number 4. So this is where you kind of map front to back what's required for each of these. So again, if I'm taking payments as an example, you would typically break this down into 4 or 5 steps. So receive the payment instruction, check the validity, process it, release it, it's received by the customer. Very high level. But then below that, you would say, well, okay, what systems do I need for each of those steps? What third-party systems do I need? What people do I need? What premises do I need? What data and information do I need? And if you can catalog those, you end up with a really quite nice, simple matrix that shows you all the elements that if they go wrong and they don't pull together, you could exceed your impact tolerance. But within each of those areas probably has its own RTO or recovery time. If you lose access to your premises, how long does it take you to cut over to your backup, etc., your backup data center? Through COVID, we've strengthened a lot on the people side, which was probably weaker before COVID. And then number 5 is around this severe but plausible scenario. So again, I think one of the early points that was discussed is, well, how far do you go on this? Is it acceptable to the regulator that there are just some things that you can't recover from within your set tolerances? And the answer, and I think the UK was quite nimble in this, if that's a nice word. They talked about designing severe but plausible scenarios. Of course, they don't define exactly what that is. So, this is a scenario that's severe is going to mean that you can't provide either the important business service or the critical operation, but it needs to be plausible. So an example of going through this and deciding with a company, with a client that it's not plausible was around loss of access to your third-party payment system. In the UK, you'll have your big clearers who are actually doing, whether it's Barclays, HSBC, or etc. So they were saying if that third party goes down, and I think this helps answer one of the questions, hopefully that's come up as well. So if your third party provider that goes down, for instance, your payment infrastructure, do I need to have a secondary one just in case? Now, the logical answer to that in the end was actually that was severe but not plausible, for the simple fact that it's a very resilient payment infrastructure, but then also the cost of doing that actually was prohibitive. You'd be duplicating everything. And the idea about resilience is not to duplicate everything you've got. It's about using what you've got really well and understanding where the risks are. And the third party risk really is the growing one. Again, we're seeing through the different cyber attacks. There's Marks and Spencer in the UK that was caused by, it came through a third party, and they've learned the hard way that they can't outsource their responsibility, and it's their reputation that is suffering. So this whole thing around severe but plausible scenarios, it's taking the results and the outcomes from your business continuity planning, if you like, and then examining those in a more holistic way and going through those and actually challenging people. In a desktop exercise, can be very useful. Well, how would you do this? How would you do that? Would it really work? What happens if you don't meet your RTO? It's asking those what ifs, until you get to a point that's actually no longer realistic. And at that point, you can say, actually, yes, we're resilient. Other times you identify vulnerabilities and then you take actions on those vulnerabilities, and then you move forward through this cycle of gradual improvement. So again, the other question around here is around the changing risk landscape. How do we get to that stage of operational resilience? And I think the answer is gradually, kind of bit by bit. This does not happen overnight, but we really are seeing firms bringing this all together, which is really quite interesting. Then, sorry, just quickly, the last couple of points, lessons learned. So that's, looking at what's happened from incidents, where are your vulnerabilities, how can you improve things there? Communication plans, having those ready, internal and external, ready to go, if you like. Again, I think firms have learned a lot on this already. And then the final part is this kind of annual self-assessment or report, where essentially the board sees the whole picture, where they are, the vulnerabilities, the actions that are still ongoing, and they essentially sign off on that. So this is one way for the board to have oversight. So again, going back to the first question, how do you ensure board responsibility, if you like? So this self-assessment can bring all the different elements together and allow the board to see the full picture, and any issues that still need to be worked on. So, this can be one way in which you're actually able to provide that oversight. Andrew, Jimmy?
Thank you, David. And adding on that question before we move on that question of objectively reconciling the BCM recovery time objectives with the OR impact, especially when there are external dependencies. So I feel here this issue should be resolved since the beginning, once you initiate the contract with the vendor. Like initially, when we're doing the contract, you should be aware of his business or their business continuity arrangements. And if their business continuity arrangements do not match or are aligned with your tolerance appetite or your risk appetite, then here you shouldn't accept, or you should at least figure out a way to correct it. And another point, in addition to the desktop exercises that David mentioned, very beneficial exercise would be a live simulation. Of course, this cannot be done like in the beginning, but maybe later on in the next year or the next, as you gradually evolve. When you do a live simulation of a DR exercise or a business continuity exercise, it's very important to include your third-party vendors with you, so that you really can test ability, and not only it's going to be on paper. So this is
yeah, and I'll hand over to Andrew in a second because he's done a lot of work on third parties, but absolutely that should be done already around third party risk management. So when I was talking about the scenarios and the desktop, that would include looking at what happens if your third parties fail and how can you recover. So it would actually draw all of that in as well. So Andrew, I think you wanted to say something.
So the third party element, I mean, if we think of that third party life cycle, onboarding, ongoing, offboarding, certainly during that onboarding process, then one of the questions that you should be asking yourself is, does this third party's resilience meet my particular resilience expectations? And then once you're in the ongoing phase, then you should continually be asking that question. Because the reality is you are accountable for that critical operation, even if your third party lets you down. You know, that it's not the third party that's accountable, particularly in the eyes of the regulator and the customers, it's you. So you have to take steps in order to make sure that your third parties can't damage your operational resilience. And interestingly, in the UK, we saw a 3-year period before operational resilience started March 2022, and there were a number of things you had to do to get to the starting line. And then the requirement came into force in March 2025. And part of that 3 years was you could run scenarios, understand if you could meet your tolerances, and then take action to make sure that you could. So yeah, taking those considerations into account is key.
And now, Andrew, that the challenge in terms of managing those vulnerabilities from third parties also includes intragroup,
Yes.
which is obviously a key area, and particularly in the Middle East region as well, in terms of a lot of dependence on group resources, particularly from an IT perspective. And obviously that has been a big challenge as well in the UK with certainly a lot of the firms that we've been working with in terms of where they have these dependencies on group, particularly for IT, and how you manage that and manage those vulnerabilities.
And just to take up on perhaps on another question, which is, are we talking about resilience or are we talking about recovery? There's kind of two things going on. If you have, I mean, for a start, it's operational resilience is a disruption that impacts your critical operations. So there is some sort of breakdown, but you've got two things going on. You're obviously trying to resolve whatever's caused that disruption in technical terms. If your IT system has gone down, then you need to be recovering that. But you also need to be asking the question, is there something I can do to provide my critical operation even though I have this disruption? So, you know, if your phone lines go down and your customers can't contact you, you know, you could go online and put a message saying, our phone lines are down, please contact us, you know, via our app or whatever. So there's the recovery piece. How do I end the disruption? But the key part, and that's business continuity. The operational resilience element is how do I continue to provide that critical operation even though I've had this disruption?
Thank you,
Yeah,
Andrew.
and so Abhishek raised a really another good question. Actually, we're talking with the client on this at the moment around Bloomberg, given recent outages. So I think Jimmy mentioned earlier on that within the UK, they're looking for, I think, for some critical third parties to fall under regulation. So I think it's quite likely that you'll see that some of the big companies like Bloomberg, Microsoft, etc., are captured by this. So it is a problem, especially for smaller banks, smaller institutions where they essentially just take it or leave it. And I think that is an area that's of growing focus, and it's probably something they're not going to be able to hide from for too much longer, I think, if that makes sense. Dora is also looking at that as well, very much, particularly. I know Microsoft is kind of captured by that, and is having to provide certain assurances through the Dora framework.
Exactly. So we have another question from the audience. We answered most, but let's move on. Okay, so one of the attendees is asking, so in terms of best practice, how are banks establishing the operation resilience function? Is it under operational risk as a separate unit, or are they renaming the operational risk unit as operational resilience, combining ORM and BCM?
I think this is, I'm not going to dodge the question because I'm going to try and answer it, but in some ways it's a function of the size of the organization. And so, you know, we've got some clients that are quite small organizations. We've got some clients that are quite big. You know, if you're a very big organization, I would think you need to have an op risk team and an operational resilience team with their separate managers reporting up to the CRO or the head of non-financial risk, again, depending on the size of organization. But if you're a smaller organization, then certainly we're seeing firms that are incorporating operational resilience into the op risk function. They're not, I mean, the question is, should you rename it operational resilience? We're not seeing that. We're seeing people that previously were the head of op risk, they're now the head of op risk and resilience. You know, op risk, we've said it a number of times, op resilience is the outcome of good op risk management. So you can't kind of disappear op risk management and pretend it doesn't exist. So if you're a small organization and you want it in a single unit, then that's your, in my view, that should be your operational risk and operational resilience function.
Thank you, Andrew. We have lots of questions. Honestly, we'll try to answer as much as possible. So another question. So let me see. Okay, so by resilience, do we mean continuing with no downtime while facing incidents? Of course, to answer it briefly, of course, no. Like, there will always be sort of maybe a downtime, but you're always try to minimize it as much as possible. And this is where your maximum tolerable outage setting would be before we speak about RTO, because you're saying if we're talking about RTO, then we're speaking of recovery. And this brings us back to our previous discussion as well, that regulators will always expect, or, you know, like if we even speak pragmatically, like there is no way that you can eliminate the risk most of the times to zero. So you will have some sort of downtime accordingly. Another question.
So just people are asking if we can share the content. I think that's possible, isn't it? To share?
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. So just minding the time. Let me just let's just answer one or two quick questions and then we'll wrap this up, and then we'll take those questions hopefully to the next webinar, the remaining question. So one of the questions that we got is based on our experience in the region and Europe, etc. What are the 3 key challenges that face I know it's a long question, Andrew. I'm seeing you smiling, but let's try to answer it briefly, because I'm pretty sure most of our attendees are facing those challenges.
I'm smiling because I couldn't get it to 3.
I know, but top 3.
I'm going to cheat and give you 4. The key one, as you go through this process and you follow that structure that David talked about, is at every stage, document what it is you're doing. And it's an old regulatory statement: evidence of absence is absence of evidence. Jimmy's laughing because I use it all the time. So if you can't document how you've arrived at your critical operations, how you've arrived at your impact tolerances, then you're in a ridiculous situation. So throughout the whole process, document, adopt a structured approach, and that's the approach David had. Start as soon as possible. I talked about the fact that there was a kind of warm-up period and then 3 years in the UK. This is not something you're going to achieve overnight. And the final one, which is where I ended up for, is leverage what you have already. Don't go off and rebuild build a whole separate function. Leverage off what you're already doing. Jimmy, I don't know if you want to add any.
I guess I had 3 key learnings. One would be around the importance of collaboration, both in terms of working with different functions within the organization across the first and second line. We've already talked about a little bit. Collaboration with your regulators to understand what their expectations are and how those are evolving. And of course, the collaboration and engagement with third parties, absolutely crucial. The other one is around planning, proactive planning. You know, we have these idioms and sayings that hold a lot of wisdom, but the one about failing to prepare is to prepare to fail, I think is key when it comes to operational resilience. So having that good planning in place, and particularly around that testing that we've already talked about a bit. And then just finally, the thing about culture. So I think culture is so important. You can have all the processes and frameworks in place, but if you don't change the culture and inculcate and encourage and incentivize a resilient culture where people are encouraged to actually think creatively, think about those plan Bs, have that adaptive mindset rather than just waiting for when the RTO is reached and you've recovered the system. I think that's absolutely critical. And that's almost the stage we're at in the UK of really trying to inculcate that resilient culture. So they will be the three key ones for me.
Thank you, Jimmy, Andrew. So just one final question before we wrap things up. So another question from the attendees is, when operating under severe resource constraints, how would you determine whether to prioritize hardening your own critical systems versus ensuring the resilience of external third-party providers whose failure would collapse your core operations, especially when those providers refuse to share their continuity plans or testing results? Partially, this has been answered previously, but again, very quickly, I feel if any third party is refusing to share their continuity plans, and honestly, I do feel that most of them do share, just include them in your test. They can't refuse this, actually, and some regulators sort of make it mandatory. So I feel this would be really, how do you say, practical resolution.
So Ilya, can I just add to that?
Yeah, sure, of course, David.
Kind of the choice, that kind of choice, I think depends on the risk that's been posed, and then also maybe the cost of addressing the risk. So typically, I'd say internal around your systems is going to be financially greater. The one around the third-party providers is going to be probably around resourcing and the ability to do that and have people to do it. So I think whenever you're looking at this kind of very understandable choices that have to be made, I think it's looking at, well, what's the risk, including, I guess, compliance risk, because then the other way in which you get budget these days is, you know, it's a regulatory requirement. So I think those kind of choices is when you really need to look at the risks very clearly. You know, what's the cost, how long, how difficult is it, how long it's going to take. So I think that's an important part of this. And yeah, and again, as Eli's highlighted, and I think everybody's looking at this whole thing around third-party providers and the fact that you can't outsource your responsibilities is a really growing area, and particularly I think within Saudi, you know, we know that there's some kind of a consultation paper out on this where they're really looking to strengthen this area. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, David. So with this, although there are many questions left, but don't want to take much time from everyone and the attendees, since we already passed the allowed time. I want to thank you again, everyone, Jimmy, David, Andrew, for your time, and I would thank the attendees. One last thought, again, if some of you would like a one-on-one session, any question you might have, if you would like to deep dive into any topic for clarification, or maybe if you're seeking some support or help, please do let us know. And we hope to see you in our next webinars. So tune in and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Eli.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.